Emma Thompson wiped her small hands on her yellow dress as she ran through the village streets of Millbrook. The morning sun was just beginning to warm the cobblestone paths, and she could already hear the familiar sound of James Wilson chopping wood behind his family's cottage. At 8 years old, Emma knew exactly where to find her best friend every morning. "James," she called out breathlessly as she rounded the corner. "Come quickly. The river is perfect for skipping stones today." James looked up from the pile of kindling, his brown hair messy from sleep. Even at 8, he was careful and thoughtful, always finishing his chores before play. But when Emma called, he never could resist her bright smile and endless energy. "Just let me stack these properly," he said, carefully arranging the wood. "Father says if we do things right the first time, we won't have troubles later." Emma danced impatiently from foot to foot, watching clouds drift lazily across the blue sky. She loved James dearly, but sometimes she wished he would be more spontaneous. While he worried about stacking wood perfectly, she dreamed of adventures. Beyond their small village, the two children spent that morning by the river, as they had every summer morning for as long as either could remember. Emma threw stones with wild enthusiasm, laughing when they sank immediately. James took his time, finding the flattest stones and sending them dancing across the water's surface with careful precision. "When I grow up," Emma announced, lying on her back in the soft grass, "I'm going to see the whole world. I'll live in London and teach children in a big school with hundreds of students." James plucked a dandelion and twirled it between his fingers. "London sounds loud and crowded," he said thoughtfully. "I think I'd rather stay here. Millbrook has everything we need: the river, the oak tree, our families, fresh air." "But don't you want to see what's out there?" Emma sat up, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. "There are museums and theatres and libraries with thousands and thousands of books." James smiled at her excitement, though he couldn't quite understand it himself. To him, happiness was right here, this moment with his best friend. The gentle sound of water flowing over stones, the familiar comfort of home. Years passed like pages turning in a well-loved book. Emma and James grew taller. Their voices changed, and their childhood games slowly gave way to longer conversations under the old oak tree. Emma never stopped talking about her dreams of leaving Millbrook. James never stopped listening. Though a quiet worry grew in his heart with each passing year, the village of Millbrook remained wonderfully unchanged. Mrs. Patterson still baked the best apple pies and sold them from her kitchen window. Mr. Davies still told the same stories about his adventures as a young sailor. The seasons came and went in their predictable rhythm: spring flowers, summer warmth, autumn colors, winter snow. But Emma was changing faster than the seasons. She studied harder than anyone else in their small village school. She borrowed books from anyone who would lend them, reading late into the night by candlelight. Her teachers praised her intelligence and encouraged her dreams of university. James watched his best friend prepare to leave him, and though he was proud of her achievements, he felt a growing sadness he couldn't quite name. He knew Emma belonged in a bigger world, but he couldn't imagine Millbrook without her laughter echoing through the streets on the evening before Emma's 16th birthday. They sat together under their oak tree, as they had thousands of times before. The familiar ritual felt different now, heavy with the knowledge that everything was about to change. "I got into university," Emma said quietly. "The letter came today. I leave next month." James had known this moment would come, but hearing the words still felt like a stone dropping into his stomach. He nodded, trying to smile. "That's wonderful, Emma. You've worked so hard for this." Emma looked at her best friend, seeing the sadness he was trying to hide. They had never talked about what would happen when she left. both of them avoiding the painful subject. But now they could avoid it no longer. The next day, Emma's birthday celebration felt more like a farewell party. The entire village came to wish her well, bringing small gifts and sharing fond memories. But as evening approached and the guests went home, Emma found herself alone with James by their special tree. The sky painted itself in brilliant shades of orange and pink as the sun began to set. Emma reached into her pocket and pulled out a simple bracelet she had woven from blue and pink string, the colors she had always associated with their friendship. Her hands trembled slightly as she offered it to James. The weight of leaving, of potentially losing the most important person in her life, suddenly felt overwhelming. She looked into his familiar brown eyes and made the most important promise of her young life. Neither of them knew, as they watched that beautiful sunset together, that it would be their last for many years to come. They couldn't imagine how different they would become, or how much they would both need to grow before they could truly understand what their promise meant. Emma Thompson stood at the window of her London flat, watching the busy street below. Cars honked impatiently in the morning traffic, and people hurried past with coffee cups and newspapers. At 31, she had everything she had dreamed of. As a young girl in Millbrook, her teaching position at Westfield Academy was respected and well-paid. Her engagement ring caught the light as she adjusted her silk scarf. David would pick her up soon for another evening at the theatre. Her flat was decorated with modern furniture and expensive art. The walls were painted in sophisticated colors that interior design magazines recommended. Everything was perfect, organized, and exactly as she had planned. Yet sometimes, in quiet moments like this, Emma felt a strange emptiness she could not explain. 300 miles away in Millbrook, James Wilson was already hours into his workday. The bakery ovens had been burning since 4 in the morning, filling the small shop with the warm smell of fresh bread and pastries. His hands, now rough from years of kneading dough and carrying heavy flour sacks, worked automatically as his mind wandered. The morning routine never changed. First, he prepared the daily bread that the village depended on. Then he checked on his mother, who spent most days sitting by the window in their small apartment above the bakery. She had grown frail since his father died 2 years ago, and James worried constantly about leaving her alone. The bakery had been in the Wilson family for 3 generations, but it barely made enough money to cover expenses. James often worked late into the evening, trying to balance the books and plan for the next month. He never complained, though sometimes he wondered what his life might have been like if he had been braver about change. As Patterson stopped by every morning for her usual loaf of brown bread, she was one of the few people who remembered when James and Emma were inseparable children. "Any word from Emma lately?" she asked, as she did every few months. James shook his head, forcing a smile. "She's very busy in London. Important work, teaching at that fancy school." Mrs. Patterson nodded knowingly. The entire village had watched Emma leave and never return. They had also watched James stay and sacrifice his own dreams for a family duty. Some whispered that he was foolish to waste his life waiting for someone who had clearly forgotten about Millbrook. Others admired his loyalty and dedication. Emma rarely thought about James anymore, though occasionally something would remind her of their childhood friendship. A certain shade of blue might bring back memories of summer days by the river. The smell of fresh bread in a London bakery might make her pause for a moment, remembering simpler times. But these moments passed quickly, swept away by the demands of her busy, successful life. David was everything Emma thought she wanted in a husband. He was intelligent, wealthy, and shared her appreciation for culture and fine living. Their engagement had been featured in the society pages of Seoul magazines, They attended gallery openings and charity events together, always perfectly dressed and socially appropriate. When people asked Emma about her background, she would mention growing up in a charming village but rarely gave details. Her sophisticated friends found rural life quaint but ultimately boring. Emma learned to present herself as someone who had always belonged in their world of expensive restaurants and weekend trips to Paris. The phone call came on a Tuesday evening while Emma was preparing for a dinner party. Her aunt's voice was shaky and urgent. Emma's mother had collapsed at home and was in the hospital. The doctors were not sure if she would recover. Emma felt the world shift round her as she listened to the details. Her mother, who had always seemed strong and eternal, was suddenly fragile and mortal. Guilt crashed over like a wave as she realized she had not visited Millbrook in 5 years. She had been too busy, too important, too afraid of being pulled back into a life she had worked so hard to escape. The drive to Millbrook took for hours through countryside that gradually became more familiar. Emma had rented a car, as she no longer owned one in London where public transportation was more convenient. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as memories flooded back with each passing mile. The village appeared round a bend in the road exactly as she remembered it. The stone cottages still had their tiny gardens bursting with flowers. The narrow streets still curved in ways that made no sense to modern traffic. The river still sparkled in the afternoon sunlight, and the old oak tree still stood guard over the memories of her childhood. Emma parked near the hospital and walked slowly through the village centre. Everything felt smaller than she remembered, but also more precious somehow. The familiar sights that had once seemed limiting now felt comforting and real in a way her London life sometimes did not. She was lost in these thoughts when she saw him. James emerged from the bakery, flour dusting his dark apron, his hair now shorter and touched with early grey. He looked older, more serious, but unmistakably the boy who had once been her closest friend. Their eyes met across the street, and for a moment, 15 years disappeared completely. Emma sat beside her mother's hospital bed, holding the familiar hand that had once braided her hair and packed her school lunches. The steady beeping of machines filled the quiet room. Her mother looked so small and fragile among the white sheets and medical equipment. The doctors said she was stable but would need weeks of recovery. During her daily visits to the hospital, Emma found herself walking through Millbrook's streets afterward. The village felt like a living museum of her childhood. Every corner held memories she had carefully packed away in her mind. The post office where she had mailed her university application. The school where she had dreamed of bigger things. The church where the whole village still gathered on Sundays. She tried to avoid the bakery, but in a village as small as Millbrook, avoiding anyone was nearly impossible. When she needed groceries or stopped for a coffee at the small cafe, she would inevitably see James. He was always working, either in the bakery or helping elderly neighbors with repairs or carrying heavy bags from the market. Their first conversation happened by accident outside the pharmacy. Emma was picking up medication for her mother when James emerged carrying supplies for his own mother's care. "How is she doing?" James asked, nodding toward the hospital direction. "Better each day, thank you," Emma replied formally. "And your mother?" "Good days and bad days," he said with a tired smile that didn't reach his eyes. "But we manage." The conversation felt stilted and uncomfortable. They were using the polite words of strangers, not the easy communication of people who had once shared every secret. Emma noticed the lines round James's eyes, the way his shoulders carried the weight of constant responsibility. James saw Emma's expensive clothes, her perfect hair, the confidence that came from years of success in the outside world. Several more awkward encounters followed. At the grocery store, James helped Emma find items that used to be as familiar as breathing at the village green. They nodded politely when their paths crossed. Each meeting reinforced how different they had become, how wide the gap between their lives had grown. Emma tried calling David every evening, but found it increasingly difficult to explain her extended stay. Her London life felt distant and unreal. From her childhood bedroom in her mother's cottage, David grew impatient with her inability to give him a definite return date. "Surely you can hire proper care for your mother," he suggested during one phone call. "We have the charity gala next week, and the Pemberton wedding the week after. People are asking where you are." Emma found herself defending her decision to stay, though she could not fully explain it even to herself. Something in Millbrook was calling to her, demanding her attention in ways she did not understand. The breaking point came on a warm evening when Emma decided to visit the old oak tree. She had been avoiding it, knowing it would bring up too many painful memories. But her mother's illness had made her think about time and how quickly it could run out. She needed to face the places that had shaped her, even if it hurt. She was surprised to find James already there, sitting in the exact spot where they used to spend hours as children. He looked up when he heard her footsteps on the familiar path. For a moment, neither spoke. The tree seemed larger and older, its branches heavy with 15 years of seasons they had not shed. Emma sat down carefully, maintaining distance between them. The river sounds were exactly the same, gentle and constant. Birds called from the trees as evening approached. The setting should have been peaceful, but the silence between them felt thick with unspoken hurt. When James finally spoke, his words cut through the pretense they had been maintaining. His voice was soft but filled with years of accumulated pain. The accusation was simple but devastating. Emma's defensive response came automatically. But even as she said the words, she knew they rang hollow. James continued looking at the water, his profile etched with sadness. When he spoke about his daily life, his voice held a bitter edge Emma had never heard before. She realized he saw a departure not as the brave pursuit of dreams, but as an abandonment of everything and everyone who had mattered to her. Emma felt tears building as she tried to explain her choices, the dreams that had seemed so important and noble when she was young suddenly felt selfish and cruel in the face of James's quiet sacrifice. She had followed her ambitions while he had stayed to care for aging parents, maintain family traditions, and keep the village community strong. James's words about running away hit her like a physical blow. Emma knew there was truth in them, but the accusation still felt unfair. She had not run away from responsibility. She had run toward opportunity. But sitting there in the place where they had been so happy together, she began to question whether the two were really so different. The bracelet had stayed with Emma through university, through her early teaching jobs, through her engagement to David. She had kept it in her jewelry box, moving it from apartment to apartment, never wearing it but never throwing it away. Now, pulling it out, she realized it represented everything she had gained and everything she had lost. James's final words struck at the heart of their broken friendship. He was right. She had preserved the symbol while abandoning the meaning behind it. Emma called David that evening to tell him she would be staying in Millbrook indefinitely. The conversation did not go well. David could not understand why she would choose to waste her time in what he called that backward little village when a real life was waiting in London. When Emma tried to explain about her mother's recovery and her own need to stay, David's voice grew cold and impatient. "You're throwing away everything we've built together," he said. "For what? To play nurse in some place that doesn't matter." Emma hung up the phone feeling surprisingly relieved rather than upset. David's reaction showed her something important about their relationship that she had been too busy to notice before. He loved the successful London version of herself, but he had no interest in understanding the deeper parts of who she was or where she came from. The next morning, Emma walked to the village school. The headmaster, Mr. Collins, was a kind man who remembered teaching her when she was young. When Emma offered to volunteer while the regular teacher was on maternity leave, his face lit up with gratitude. "We could certainly use the help," he said warmly. "These children don't get many chances to learn from someone with your experience and education." Emma stepped into the small classroom and felt something inside her heart settle into place. The children looked up at her with curious, eager faces. Some were shy, others bold, but all of them hungry to learn. She realized that teaching here felt different from her prestigious London school. These children needed her in a more personal way. Their families knew her name. Their grandparents remembered her childhood. Their futures would be shaped by the care she showed them. During her lunch break, Emma would often see James making deliveries. Round the village, he brought fresh bread to elderly residents who could no longer walk to the bakery. He fixed broken steps and leaky roofs for neighbors who could not afford to hire help. Emma began to understand that James had not simply stayed in Millbrook out of duty. He had become an essential part of keeping the community strong and caring. Her mother was recovering well, but slowly. Emma spent every evening reading to her, preparing her meals and listening to stories about village life during the years Emma had been away. She learned about neighbors who had died, babies who had been born, marriages and divorces, and small dramas that made up the fabric of community. "Life I missed so much," Emma said one evening as she helped her mother with her medicine. "Life kept going." Her mother replied gently, "But you're here now. That's what matters." The afternoon when everything changed started grey and rainy. Emma was walking home from school when she heard shouting from the village square. Mrs. Patterson, now in her 70s, had slipped on the wet stones and was lying motionless on the ground. A small crowd had gathered, but nobody seemed to know what to do. Emma ran forward and knelt beside the elderly woman. Mrs. Patterson was unconscious, her face pale and her breathing shallow. Emma's first aid training from her London school kicked in automatically. She checked for a pulse, tilted Mrs. Patterson's head to keep her airway clear, and began calling out instructions to the frightened villagers round her. "Someone call an ambulance," she said firmly, "and we need blankets to keep her warm." Just then, James appeared at her side, without speaking. They worked together as naturally as if they had been doing it for years. James brought his car as close as possible while Emma carefully monitored Mrs. Patterson's condition. When the ambulance would take too long to arrive from the nearest town, they made the decision to drive her to the hospital themselves. James drove while Emma sat in the back seat, keeping Mrs. Patterson stable during the 20-minute journey. They spoke only when necessary, but Emma felt a connection with James that had nothing to do with their complicated past. They were simply two people working together to help someone who needed them. At the hospital, the doctors said their quick thinking had probably saved Mrs. Patterson's life. She had suffered a stroke, and getting her to medical care quickly had prevented serious brain damage. Emma and James sat in the waiting room while the doctors worked, both of them exhausted and worried. The silence between them now felt different, not angry or hurt, but comfortable in the way it used to be when they were children. When they finally began to speak, the words came more easily than they had in weeks. Emma found herself explaining feelings she had never put into words before. She talked about the pressure she had felt to succeed, the fear that staying in Millbrook would somehow diminish her, the loneliness she had discovered in her perfect London life. James listened without judgment, occasionally nodding in understanding. When James spoke about his own fears, Emma heard the boy she had once known so well. He had been afraid not just of being left behind, but of being forgotten entirely. He had worried that Emma would outgrow him, that their friendship would become something she was embarrassed about in her sophisticated new world. "I never forgot you," Emma said softly. "I just didn't know how to bridge the distance between who I became and who we used to be together." The conversation continued as they walked back through the village under a sky that had finally cleared. Emma stared at the resignation letter on her laptop screen for 3 days before she finally pressed send. The words looked so simple, but they represented the biggest change she had ever made in her life. Her headmaster at Westfield Academy called immediately, offering her a raise, more vacation time, anything to make her reconsider. But Emma's mind was made up. Breaking her engagement to David was even harder than leaving her job. She met him at their favorite London restaurant, a place where they had shared many happy evenings. David arrived expecting to discuss wedding plans and was shocked when Emma gently returned his ring instead. "This doesn't make sense," he said, staring at the diamond ring on the white tablecloth. "We have everything planned. The church is booked. The invitations ordered. What will I tell people?" Emma felt sad, but not surprised that his first concern was about appearances rather than their relationship. "Tell them I realized I wasn't ready to be the wife you deserve," she said kindly. "You're a good man, David. But we want different things from life." David tried to convince her she was making a terrible mistake, throwing away her career and future for what he called a foolish romantic notion. But Emma had never felt more certain about anything in her life. The London life that had once seemed so important now felt like a beautiful cage that had kept her from becoming who she was truly meant to be. Moving back to Millbrook felt like learning to breathe again after holding her breath for 15 years. Emma rented a small cottage near the river and used her London savings to transform an empty shop into a tutoring centre. She painted the walls in cheerful colours and filled the space with books, comfortable chairs, and learning materials. The village children were eager and grateful students. Emma helped 10-year-old Sophie with her reading, guided teenage Michael through his mathematics, and prepared several older students for their university entrance exams. She discovered that teaching in Millbrook was more rewarding than anything she had done in London. Here, she could see the direct impact of her work on individual lives and families. James watched Emma's transformation with growing admiration. Her courage to change her entire life inspired him to take risks of his own. He had always been content to keep things exactly as they were, but seeing Emma chase her true happiness made him realize he had been limiting himself out of fear. James began experimenting with new recipes and modern baking techniques. He installed a website for the bakery and started offering weekend cooking classes for visitors who wanted to learn traditional English baking. Soon, food bloggers were writing about the hidden gem of Wilson's Bakery, and tourists began making special trips to Millbrook just to take James's classes. The village started changing in wonderful ways. Emma's tutoring centre attracted families who appreciated quality education in a small-town setting. James's cooking classes brought visitors who stayed at the local bed and breakfast, ate at the village pub, and bought crafts from local artists. Millbrook was becoming a place where traditional values and modern opportunities could exist together. Emma and James found themselves working together more and more. Emma would bring her students to the bakery for mathematics lessons about measurements and fractions. James would visit the tutoring center to teach children about the history and traditions of their village. Their old friendship slowly grew into something deeper and more mature. On a perfect summer evening 6 months after Emma's return, they decided to do something symbolic of their new beginning. James had ordered a young oak sapling from the local nursery, and together they carried it to the spot beside the old tree where they had made their first promise so many years ago. The sapling looked tiny next to the massive trunk of the ancient oak. But Emma could imagine how it would grow and flourish over the years. As they dug the hole and carefully planted the small tree, she thought about how much both she and James had grown during their time apart. "This little tree will need time and care before it's strong," James said, patting the soil gently round. "The roots, just like us," Emma replied, taking his dirt-covered hand in hers. They sat under the old oak as the sun set, painting the sky in the same beautiful colors Emma remembered from her 16th birthday. But everything felt different now. Then, they had been young people afraid of losing each other. Now, they were adults who had chosen to build something together. "I used to think our first promise failed because we didn't try hard enough," Emma said, watching the new sapling's leaves flutter in the evening breeze. "But maybe it succeeded in a way we never expected. It brought us back to each other when we were finally ready." James squeezed her hand gently. "We had to become ourselves before we could truly be together." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Emma knew she had found what she had been searching for all along. Not in the bright lights of London or the excitement of city life, but here in the quiet village where love grew slowly and roots ran deep. The promise they made that evening was different from their childhood vow. It was not about holding on desperately to the past, but about building a future together with patience, wisdom, and hope.